So if you've walked into the health aisle of, well, any store lately, you know the supplement section is just completely swamped by the gut health industry.
Oh, absolutely.
We were talking probiotics, prebiotics, and now postbiotics. It's this whole world of confusing acronyms, huge marketing claims, and honestly, a lot of hype.
And that noise is exactly what we're here to cut through today. I mean, our mission is to help you become a savvy consumer, someone who can actually read a label and understand what works and what, well, probably doesn't.
Oh, okay, so let's jump right in with the definitions, because if you don't get the difference between these three biotics, you're already lost. What are we actually dealing with here?
Right. So the sources give us very clear distinctions. Probiotics are the ones everyone's heard of.
The live ones.
The live ones. They're defined as live microorganisms that, when you take them in adequate amounts, give you health benefit. The key words there are live and adequate amounts.
Which means they have to survive on the shelf and, in your body.
Precisely. And that requires some serious consistency in how they're made and labeled.
Got it. The living organism with a proven benefit. Okay, so what about prebiotics? Is that the fuel?
That's a perfect way to put it. Prebiotics are substances, usually we're talking about fermentable fibers, that are selectively used by your own microorganisms.
Oh, so they feed the good bacteria you already have.
Exactly. Think of it as high-quality, targeted fuel for the ecosystem that's already in your gut.
Okay, which brings us to the new one on the block, postbiotics.
And this is where it gets interesting. Postbiotics are the non-viable microbial components, the metabolites. They're what's left over after the microbes do their work.
The output.
The output, things like short-chain fatty acids, vitamins, signaling molecules. And what's really compelling here is that they offer a different path, especially where live organisms might pose, safety or formulation challenges.
That's a great point. So
Yeah.
Postbiotics are just the result of the microbe's work. Why would you bother taking them directly? Why not just take the live microbe and let it do its thing?
Well, that's a fantastic question, and it really gets to the heart of the formulation problem. While the live microbe, the probiotic, is the ideal delivery system, in theory.
In theory.
In theory, yes. Its stability is precarious. They need specific temperatures, specific packaging. Postbiotics, since they aren't alive, are just vastly easier to handle, to store, and to put into functional foods or medicines.
So it lowers the bar logistically.
It lowers the bar significantly. And what's more, if you want an immediate systemic effect, delivering that metabolite directly bypasses the whole question of whether the probiotic will even colonize successfully, which is never a guarantee.
That feels like a huge insight for where the field is going.
Okay.
Okay, let's get to the core of this deep dive.
Yeah.
You said there's one single factor for efficacy, and that is strain specificity.
Yes. We have to focus on this because relying on a generic claim like just seeing the word lactobacillus on a label is, for all intents and purposes, meaningless for clinical outcomes.
Okay, let's unpack that. Because when you stand in the aisle, you see those big categories. Lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, maybe the yeast, Saccharomyces. Why is that not enough?
Because the benefit, the actual efficacy, lives entirely in the details of the strain.
The little numbers and letters at the end.
Exactly. A given species, let's take Lactobacillus acidophilus, might have dozens of individual strains, and these strains can have wildly different effects.
So one might help with, say, diarrhea, and another does nothing for it.
Precisely. You could have one strain of Lactobacillus acidophilus that's clinically proven to help with antibiotic-associated diarrhea, while another strain from the exact same species has zero clinical impact for that same condition.
That is literally the difference between buying a solution and an expensive placebo.
Yeah.
And this must have a huge impact on regulation.
It absolutely does. And this is where you, as a consumer, need to be aware. Probiotics usually fall under dietary supplements, which mainly just requires safety and honest labeling.
Yeah.
But if a company wants to claim it treats something specific, like irritable bowel syndrome, that requires really robust clinical validation for that exact strain. Otherwise, they're misbranding the product.
Which is why we need to focus on those little alphanumeric tags. It brings us right to that key quote from the experts in our sources. I think it was Dr. Elena Rossi.
Yes, she's a clinical microbiologist, and she summarized it perfectly. She says, "The most practical takeaway is to rely on strain-specific evidence rather than genus-level claims, and to align product choices with the consumer-specific health context."
In other words, if you need relief for AD, find a product listing a strain that has published data for AD.
That's the bottom line.
Fantastic. So now that we know what to look for, let's talk about how these little guys actually work. What are the mechanisms of action? Can't be just one simple thing.
No, it's a very complex, multi-pronged effort. The first mechanism is probably the most straightforward. It's called colonization resistance.
Like a turf war.
It's the ultimate biological turf war, yes. The probiotic strains compete directly with pathogenic microbes for two things: a parking spot on the gut lining and the available food.
So they just crowd out the bad guys.
They crowd them out, exactly. The second, and you could argue most important mechanism, is metabolite production. This is where we talk about short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs.
Right.
When bacteria ferment fibers, they produce these SCFAs: butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And these are much more than just waste products.
So what do they do?
Well, butyrate, for example, is the main energy source for the cells lining your colon. It supports the health of that gut barrier. Propionate and acetate, they play roles in things like appetite and blood sugar control.
So different strains would produce different amounts or types of these SCFAs.
And that's a huge differentiator. The exact SCFA ratio depends entirely on the strain and the fiber it's eating. This is a core reason why different strains give you such different clinical outcomes.
Okay, so there's the third mechanism too.
Yes, and it's about gut barrier integrity and immune cues. These organisms are actually communicating with your immune system, helping to maintain the physical barrier of the gut and telling immune cells to calm down local inflammation.
Which means the outcome is super individualized. It's not just the pill, it's also the person taking it. My results might be totally different if I'm older or I have some other condition.
That is the critical challenge. Outcomes depend heavily on your age, your health status, your baseline microbiome, and on top of that, dosing and duration are critical.
You can't just take it for a day and expect a miracle.
No. Insufficient dosing or too short exposure will likely fail to show any benefits at all. You have to give them time and enough biomass to work.
And then there's a big one, antibiotics. They're designed to kill bacteria. How much do they mess this all up?
They throw a major wrench in the works. Antibiotics can severely reduce the colonization and the effectiveness of the probiotic strains we're trying to introduce.
Which is why timing is so important.
It's everything. If you don't take the probiotic correctly, you risk the antibiotic just wiping out the good guys before they can even get started.
Okay, that sets us up perfectly to talk about evidence. Let's give our listeners some actual names to look for on a label. What's a strain with really strong evidence?
The first one that comes to mind is Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG. You'll see it as LGG.
LGJ, got it. What's it good for?
It has a ton of research behind it, substantial evidence for reducing the risk of antibiotic-associated diarrhea, or AAD, in both kids and adults. It's a really solid, reliable strain for that specific purpose.
Okay, and what about something that isn't a bacteria? I know there's a yeast out there.
Right, that would be Saccharomyces boulardii. It's a probiotic yeast, which is unique.
So antibiotics won't kill it.
Generally, they won't, which is a huge advantage. The evidence strongly supports it for AAD prevention and also for reducing the recurrence of C. diff infections. Plus, it's very stable.
And for one of the most common reasons people are looking for these. What about IBS?
For irritable bowel syndrome, especially for symptoms like gas and discomfort, a common one to look for is Lactobacillus plantarum 299V.
The 299V.
That specific designation, yes. It has demonstrated benefits for alleviating those symptoms in certain adult populations. But again, the evidence is tied specifically to 299V.
Now, what about those multi-strain products? The ones that boast about having 10 or 15 different strains. We think more is better, but the sources suggest that's not right?
No, it's often not. You can't just assume that mixing 10 good strains gives you something 10 times better.
Why not?
Because sometimes strains are antagonistic. They might compete with each other or get in each other's way. A good multi-strain product depends entirely on the exact combination, the ratios, the dose, and whether that specific cocktail has been clinically tested as a single unit.
Otherwise, you're just buying a mystery box.
You're buying a microbial cocktail of uncertain efficacy, yes.
And what about these next generation ones you hear about, like Akkermansia?
Those are fascinating. They're aimed at very specific pathways, like Akkermansia and gut mucus health. But they are still largely under investigation. Their safety, dosing, it's all still being worked out, so they aren't really accessible to the average consumer yet.
Let's pivot to the really practical stuff. Safety and quality checks. Probiotics are generally safe, but there are some really important exceptions.
There are, and they're serious. For healthy people, the risk is very low. But for specific groups, immunocompromised people, they severely ill, or patients with a central venous line. There are rare but serious risks of bacteremia or fungemia.
So the living organism could actually get into the bloodstream and cause an infection.
Exactly. And for these vulnerable groups, neonates, people undergoing chemotherapy, clinician guidance is absolutely essential.
And this is where postbiotics have a real advantage.
A huge advantage. Since they are non-viable, they present a significantly lower risk of systemic infection for those groups.
Okay, so for the healthy consumer, what are the quality signals we should be looking for on the bottle? How can you be a detective at the shelf?
First, look at the dose. The typical range is usually between 10 to the 9 and 10 to the 11 CFU, or colony-forming units. But higher is not automatically better.
It has to be the right dose of the right strain.
Exactly. Second, the label must be precise. Genus, species, and that alphanumeric strain designation. And here's the most critical part.
What was that?
The CFU count must be guaranteed at the end of shelf life, not at the time of manufacture.
Because they die off over time.
They do. If a product says 50 billion CFU but doesn't guarantee that at the expiration date, that number is likely worthless. Also check storage, does it need refrigeration, and look for a third-party verification seal.
That point about CFU at the end of shelf life is maybe the single most practical tip from this whole deep dive. Okay, let's circle back quickly to antibiotics and timing. What is the best strategy?
Well, since antibiotics diminish colonization, the timing is key. The research generally suggests separating the probiotic from the antibiotic by at least 2 to 4 hours,
To give it a fighting chance.
to give it a window to pass through the system relatively intact. But even this is strain-specific. Some strains are more tolerant than others. You really need to rely on the product's guidance.
This has just fundamentally shifted how I think we should all be looking at this entire category. To wrap up, what's the actionable guide for everyone listening?
The ultimate takeaway is precision.
Right. Match the product to your goal based on evidence for that specific strain. Forget vague promises of gut health. If you want IBS relief, find a strain studied for IBS.
And always, always assess the safety relative to your own health status, especially if you fall into one of those vulnerable groups.
If we zoom out, what does the future look like through 2025?
I think we'll see the clear rise of postbiotics because of their safety and simplicity. But the big overarching trend is toward hyperpersonalization.
Right. Which brings up a really provocative question for anyone taking a general supplement right now. Researchers are actively working on matching specific individuals with specific strains. So if the goal is truly personalized health, how much longer will this one-size-fits-all advice even work?
It signals a necessary shift, I think. A shift away from marketing broad assumptions and toward precision nutrition guided by our own biological data. The era of a generic approach to gut health is rapidly coming to an end.
That is definitely something to chew on while you check the fine print on your next bottle. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.